This is apropos. The former diplomat has been recruiting former insiders to try to find ways to make the global body more cost-effective and efficient. But staff at the United Nations fear that his methods signal that the culture wars have arrived at the UN. Senior officials there say an ongoing liquidity crisis is already hindering the UN's ability to retain a geographically diverse, skilled workforce. From New York, France 24's Jessica Le Masurier sent this report.
It's a project called DOGE UN. It's reminiscent of Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, only it's looking into the United Nations. It's not officially connected to the US government, but its founder, former US diplomat Hugh Dugan, says he's looking for ways to cut waste at the UN.
Over time, we've seen the growth of what I call a deep state United Nations. DOGE UN is an effort to excise the waste and rogue behavior of the United Nations bureaucracy.
The US currently contributes roughly a quarter of the UN's budget annually, totalling around $20 billion. China is the second biggest contributor. The proposals put forward by DOGE UN include making interpreting staff work remotely and merging or abolishing some UN agencies. Dugan even appears to be targeting UNICEF.
It's straight in many ways to go into agendas and doctrines and ideologies which we find repulsive, frankly. DEI forms of interference in family upbringing, this notion that the child is the product of a village and not a family.
The United States has warned UN organisations against any focus on diversity, equity and inclusion.
The UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights talk about the need for equality. They talk about the need for respect of all races. This is 80 years of UN thinking. It's not some trend that is now being imposed on the world. The UN is an international bureaucracy, but it's staffed by people who have worked in war zones and in humanitarian crises. They're deeply concerned about protecting vulnerable people. The idea that it's some sort of cabal is really not true.
Many UN staff members agree that the organisation is in need of reform, but they're concerned that whilst DOGE UN is not part of the US government, its proposals could be used as a pretext to cut funding. The UN Secretary-General recently launched a reform effort called UN 80.
So we can adapt the UN, consolidate the UN, make the UN more effective and more cost-effective. What we cannot is solve the problems of the people that we no longer are able to assist for lack of resources.
US President Donald Trump has signed an executive order calling for a review of the UN over the coming months. Capitol Hill recently revived 2 bills to withdraw the US from the UN altogether.
To discuss all of this and more, we're joined now by Rosa Freedman, Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the UK-based University of Reading. Rosa, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we saw there, the UN is already feeling the pinch. Its humanitarian agency, for example, said just last week it's cutting over 2,500 staff due to funding cuts. What exactly is Donald Trump's vision for the UN?
Well, Donald Trump takes an exceptionalist and unilateralist approach to the international global order as such. It's clear that he wants to withdraw funding from the UN to downsize the scope and the scale of the work that it does, and possibly even to remove the US from being a key player within the UN structures, not only financially, but also politically.
And what do you make of this new effort, as Jessica was describing it, the DOGE UN effort? The UN gets about a quarter of its funding from the US. That is a huge amount. So how detrimental could these proposals be?
Well, the funding works along the model of a proportion of GDP. So the US is the main funder in terms of the size of its economy. But there have been various times where the US or other countries haven't paid their contributions, and that money has been made up by other states or by the European Union, by CARICOM and other countries. But the UN runs on actually quite a limited budget. We're talking sort of about $7 billion a year, and then there's a separate budget for peacekeeping operations to pay for the soldiers and the boots on the ground. Many of the parts of the UN that your viewers will know about, for example, UNICEF, UNHCR also rely on public funding, people donating money to their campaigns, or also countries giving sort of extra contributions to keep them going. But we are really talking about small sums of money compared with the kind of sums of money that it costs to run, for example, the National Health Service in the UK, or the kind of sums of money that it costs to run civil services in countries like France. And so squeezing pennies from these budgets is really going to cut to the heart of the kind of humanitarian work and relief that the UN is able to do.
And what kind of sectors then, Rosa, are most at risk? What kind of areas, countries also?
The first places that will be most at risk will be the most vulnerable countries, the least developed, and those that have already conflict and crises, whether it's around civil wars, whether it's around water and sanitation and resources. And really, the most vulnerable people who will be the most affected will be children, as they always are. It will be people with disabilities, it will be minority groups. They will be the ones that will be feeling the effect, first of all, of the cuts to the USAID programs, and now cuts to, or potential cuts to, UN programs.
Well, we saw in Jessica's report there as well, Antonio Guterres talking about how, the UN needs to be adapted. It does need a certain degree of reform. How inefficient or wasteful is it, in the words that are being used by the Trump administration?
As with all large bureaucracies, there is waste, and money does not always filter down to the communities and the beneficiaries who need it. There are high-level appointments that are very expensive, and big pension systems and everything else that may need some reform. But the way to do that reform is not to pull the money away from the UN programs. The way to do that reform is, as with any bureaucracy, to go in and to work out which of the middle managers and the higher up managers are being paid extortionate salaries and overblown salaries, and to find the cost efficiencies there, not through taking money away from UNICEF or from the World Food Programme or from vaccination programs.
And you mentioned earlier, Rosa, other countries perhaps stepping in. We saw after the earthquake in Myanmar, for example, China stepping in to fill the vacuum being left by the US. But can other countries do that on a longer term basis? Is that sustainable?
Other countries need to do that on a longer term basis. For too long, the world has relied on the United States to be the peacemaker and also the funder of programs that go to dealing with conflicts and crises around the world. Other countries do need to step up. Myanmar is a close regional neighbor to China, and China needs to be able to use its money and its power and its sort of political clout to go in, not only to help deal with the earthquake, but also to deal with the military junta who are bombing people under cover of this earthquake and under cover of the humanitarian crisis that the earthquake caused.
And with all of this uncertainty, Rosa, how can aid officials and people who are actually working on the ground prepare for what's to come? Many appear to be struggling to understand the scope of what's actually happening and what's being announced by the Trump administration.
Humanitarian workers, aid workers, people who work in peacekeeping are used to lurching from crisis to crisis, whether it's a funding crisis, whether it's a war, whether it's dealing with a natural disaster. The scale of what's coming in terms of the US pulling its funding from many of these places will really depend on whether or not the European Union, the CARICOM, China, other countries step up and say it's time that we start funding these programs rather than the reliance on the US. But for humanitarian aid workers, everything is a crisis, and I'm sure that they are as prepared for this as they are for any other crisis that comes their way.
And you touched on it earlier, Rosa, the US is already withdrawing from several UN agencies, including the Human Rights Council. Do you think it's possible that the United States will withdraw entirely from the UN?
Well, the US has withdrawn from the Human Rights Council before. It has, as I said earlier, withdrawn its funding or failed to pay under previous administrations. It's unlikely that the US will give up its seat on the Security Council, its permanent seat, its veto power, because those 5 countries that have that veto power make them the most strong and the most significant within the UN system. But it is likely under this administration that the US will play less of a role in other bodies, including at the General Assembly, which has no sort of binding powers and no really only decision-making powers, and within some of the smaller bodies around the world.
And Donald Trump will, of course, be in office when a new Secretary General is appointed next year. How do you think that might play out? Are we going to see perhaps the Trump administration or the US through its envoys vetoing certain candidates?
The appointment of a Secretary General is always tricky. It's tricky as to which regional group they will come from. So far, we've only ever had men who've been appointed, and it's about time that there was a woman leading this global organization. But I don't think that the Trump administration will pay that much attention to what is essentially a civil service job. The Secretary General is there to serve the countries that are the member states of the United Nations and not the other way around.
And Rosa, do you think post-Trump, if we can look ahead after these 4 years, would it be possible to actually reverse some of the cuts that we're seeing now and many of these closures as well that are affecting various agencies? This is, of course, only the beginning of Trump's second term in office.
The problem is that when you dismantle programs, it's very difficult to then find the expertise to restart them again. And at the most basic level, we're talking about people's livelihoods, these humanitarian workers who will then go on to other jobs and won't necessarily want to come back into the sector. But also, when you dismantle these programs, you dismantle the rule of law, you dismantle safeguarding, particularly child safeguarding. All sorts of institutional knowledge that makes life better for people will disappear overnight, and it will take many years to restart any of these again.
Rosa, thanks so much for being with us on the programme. We'll have to leave it there for now. That's Rosa Freedman, Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading. Thanks so much.